We're going to be talking about critical minerals supply chain, and how the different countries, different regions of the world are all scrambling to get hold of their own critical minerals supply chain. But to start us off, Robert, obviously you talked there about batteries, about energy storage. But when it comes to the EU and North America, and indeed the UK and Japan, they've all got a different list of critical minerals, and it covers quite a broad spectrum of things, doesn't it? I mean, can you give us a sort of set the scene on critical minerals for our audience here? What does it include apart from battery metals?
Yeah, I think you'd say that those critical raw material analyses can be quite regionally different, simply because of the industries that are being targeted or analysed in terms of their demand. So there is a geographical nuance. I think possibly also there may be a sort of relationship element in that certain regions are more reliant on sort of partner countries or other places, or are more tolerant of particular sort of supply links. So may see risks in certain jurisdictions that other regions aren't so sort of troubled by. So yeah, I think also there's probably different approaches to how those material lists and assessments are put together as well. The methodology can vary. So of course there's going to be natural deviation in what sort of comes at the top of the list and what's on the list. I think in most cases the list seems to get longer as we go on, perhaps as the realization is dawning that everything is reliant on something that's mined or extracted and difficult to get away from it.
Yeah, I mean, when we look at the motivations for putting together these lists of critical minerals, we've got the energy transition on one hand, and then we've got the wish to sort of decouple and de-risk your supply chain. When you've got, obviously China has produced a lot of these critical minerals over the years, also now Russia. To what extent is the energy transition driving this scramble for critical minerals, and to what extent is decoupling driving it?
First of all, Morten from Clarksons here. With regards to how the critical minerals is decoupling, I think that we have to see, and going forward, we're seeing an increase in the Chinese and the non-Chinese access to critical raw materials, and how that will play downstream. But we're seeing this kind of polarization, and going forward, I believe that the geopolitical tensions will increase, and that will be a kind of a more shift towards the Chinese and versus the non-Chinese access to some of these materials. And as of today, China refines the majority of the rare earth minerals, and they also refine a majority of the battery metals that are then sent to the West. And that's why we're now seeing these incentives to start the refining and also of these battery materials in the US, and hopefully also in the EU.
An interesting point that you touched on in your speech, Robert, was about the fact that obviously you're sort of representing the EU in this space, but you've got the US who are aggressively looking to get their own domestic supply chains. Competition over projects. Are there enough projects to go around?
I think there's plenty of intent to go around, but of course I think that the challenge is that, as I mentioned, resourcing those. So, I guess there's not enough resource to do everything everywhere. So naturally, where are you going to go? What's going to decide where you go? And I think the difference is with the US is that they put money on the table, and that means that those projects are naturally incentivized towards the US. So I think money talks. And in this instance, as you've seen, it's been relatively swift and I guess also detrimental to what was sort of planned in some parts of the world. I think one point to touch on though is that the US is very much a domestic plus sort of friendly linkage, and in Europe there isn't so much of that. So for example, it's going to be tough, if not impossible, for the Chinese to make a dent in the US battery value chain based on the US-China relationships. But in Europe, we're at the moment at least still open to that investment. So I guess maybe what you're going to see is perhaps even, as the point was made, maybe a, sort of localization, but deglobalization, but more of a kind of relationship, sort of build between different countries, all, aim with the same intent, but incentivized either through, political motivation or financial motivation.
And to touch on that from our perspective, some of the corporations that we have been talking to are contemplating building a refinery for the downstream processing of their battery materials. And they were contemplating some Asian location, and after the Inflation Reduction Act, they're getting such a huge push from their off-takers that they're now contemplating building this refinery in the US. So a lot of capacity that in the first aspect were perceived to be placed in Asia because of the low cost and also that was where the product was going to go, is now moved over to the US. So I think, as to add on to your point, money talks, and they have actually put the money on the table. You saw that through the Biden bipartisan infrastructure law, where they committed $2.8 billion to 21 projects, where the majority of them were processing and refining of battery materials in the US. And money talks, easy as that.
You've touched on a point there, which is that a lot of the money seems to be going towards the sort of processing and producing of batteries and things like that. Do governments realise that the fact that they need to put more money into the mines, they need to go upstream?
I think the realization is creeping in. I think the challenge is that it's a very different business model from other sort of infrastructure developments, because most of the rest of the value chain for any industry, beyond after you sort of dug it out the ground and maybe some elements of refining, in general it's more location agnostic. So yes, there are things you need, but you're not tied to necessarily something that is immovable in terms of its geological base, and therefore I think for sort of governments, it's been a sort of question of what can we do with it, and where is our sort of capital best spent and found return from, and I think that has meant there's been this sort of tendency to go towards projects that if in the case of Europe, for example, you have some countries with minimal or no raw material endowments, or at least of any sort of economic nature to invest in. So of course, you would guess that clearly the sort of thoughts there is what can we sort of develop, and what impact is that going to give for us? And it has been more on the downstream basis, and I think now you're seeing more of a, again back to this sort of partnership approach, more of a a kind of relationship build between countries with resources and without resources, and that on a corporate level, on a political level, it's starting to happen more and more. I guess we've yet to see a lot of capital sort of behind that. Of course, the US IRA approach has, at least indirectly, sort of moved that somewhat, because, of course, it's either North American or it's sort of friendly sort of country supply. So naturally, any links between companies that can do refining in North America and mining somewhere else in the world, like Australia, it's going to incentivize that upstream supply. But that hasn't been money directly into overseas projects. It's sort of catalyzed it by enabling something further downstream potentially.
Do you think there's a bit of an obviously over the last few years, China has done an awful lot of work going into Africa, building up relationships there, building roads, stadiums, putting in telecom networks, and then also getting into mining projects there. Are you going to see more work like that from the EU, do you think, trying to build stronger relationships with countries which could potentially provide their raw materials? And is the lack of engagement from maybe North America into Africa sort of creating an opportunity for the EU, do you think?
I think definitely you'll see relationships grow, improve, and mature for this particular energy transition build. And I guess already you've seen that with for example, oil and gas. That naturally the kind of Europe has shifted away from Russia and migrated towards other countries, which may not have been the most favourable relationships to sort of start building, but are more of a necessary to fill the gap. And I guess speed, or rather I should say, time isn't on our side. The question is, can the two sides form a mutually beneficial partnership? Because I think the challenge is that countries with resources do recognise their endowments and they want to get maximum value from it, and therefore often are unwilling to give that away without some sort of quid pro quo, and that often is quite a challenging sort of prospect to overcome. And the question would be, for someone like Europe, are they prepared to incentivize or invest in whatever sort of way into countries that have resources? I think that might be difficult directly for, say, Africa, at least in terms of direct government money. You might see it from development fund or other sort of maybe indirect sort of sources. I think actually where, in particular Europe, you may see more of a focus now is closer to home. So on sort of Balkans, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, more of a sort of focus around sort of bringing that into sort of more of the sphere of European influence, not necessarily sort of Africa so much. And if, I guess from what we've seen of sort of big sort of these sort of bilateral partnerships so far is, Europe sort of looking at Canada, Australia as sort of, potential good relationship building sort of partnerships for this particular energy transition.
Do you think Vladimir Putin might have some issues with you going into Kazakhstan and as, I mean, obviously Ukraine has triggered him somewhat, and the Baltic states, trying to bring them into European sphere of influence?
Absolutely, but I think that's to your point. I mean, I think that's now the the kind of way things are going, isn't it? It's sort of court, you're sort of friendly and keep them in the sort of influence and try and sideline others that are sort of coming in. And I dare say there's sort of bigger geopolitical sort of levers at play here. I'm just sort of looking at the ones that are most relevant for this battery value chain approach that I talked about, and where where the action at least seems to be moving towards.
I mean, it's a bit of a depressing picture really being painted, isn't it? It is a cold war over resources that we're going into now. And as you've mentioned in your presentation, time is running out. We're not going to meet the goals that we're trying to achieve. Isn't it time for less Cold War and more cooperation?
I think it's from kind of a global perspective that is true. It is time for that. But I think we're going the other way around. I think we're going the other way, and with the Inflation Reduction Act over in the US, and the EU might have to respond. And you also seen as China have built all of these relationship with Africa, which will be the key to providing these battery raw materials to the batteries and to our electric vehicles, and also to the energy transition that we are facing, right? So I think the key is there, but we have to cooperate. But I think unfortunately we're going in the other direction.
I mean, given the situation we're in, you mentioned that one of the goals of of your fund, of the European sort of policy, is to maybe create jobs in Europe through these things. But at the same time, you mentioned a big skills shortage. How do those two things marry up?
Yeah, I think it's another part of the transition. I think at the sort of very easy to understand level. I mean, we say for sort of vehicle manufacturer, it's different making an electric car than a internal combustion engine car. Both on actually simply putting it together, but also all of the components that are required there. So I think in a lot of cases it's reskilling. It's sort of having been good at one thing and trying to be good at something else that may not be too far away or alien in terms of its sort of skill set, but is different. So that's one element, and I think you've seen the same in energy production. So from oil and gas to renewables, I think you've seen a big shift in skills across from one industry to another. But of course, some of these areas of the value chain, simply are not transferable very directly from other sort of parts of industry. So there, a lot of the education, starts, from I guess you would say schooling and higher education, through into the marketplace. So that again sort of takes some time. But I think in a funny way, and the UK is probably a good example of this, is that some of that has been sort of pre-thought already. So I think there has been actually probably more development in some places of skill education systems building into this energy transition. And it may not be noticeable to us, like from where we sit and look at what's happening. But there is probably talent coming through now that maybe is sort of better at, say, electrochemistry or machinery production than perhaps was the case before. So at least I hope there's been a bit more foresight on the skills than there has actually the materials themselves.
I mean, China famously has made a lot of effort bringing talent from the West over to China to learn about things, and also sending students over to the West to learn what we're doing. Is it time that we should be trying to do that the other way and poach a bit of talent from over there, because that's where all the knowledge is?
I think we're in some sense already doing that, because if you look at some of the battery cell manufacturers that are now being developed in, for instance, northern part of Europe, take for instance Northvolt in Sweden and also Freyr in Norway, they have to kind of have some inspiration and some of the workforce from the companies that already have legacy within this, right? So I think it's more of it has to happen, but some of it is already happening, I believe.
Absolutely. Do we have questions from the audience at the moment? Yeah, we got a question.
A question for Robert. In terms of EU policy and the carbon border adjustment mechanism, how do you put that into your models and your future competitiveness? I mean, is that a mechanism that is going to make investing in Europe and in the supply chain you're putting together more attractive, or is it just a mechanism to try to get the rest of the world to care about carbon emissions?
Yeah, good points. I mean, I've lived and breathed some of that headache actually, because I think it definitely matters for those parts of industry where the competitiveness has, been slightly more advantageous in certain jurisdictions compared to the EU. So I think the ambition is right in terms of the idea of it. I think the impact of it is kind of more, I guess you would say, sort of financially significant, because it will mean a little bit like duties, that it could be the difference between investing in one part of the world or investing in Europe. And so, if you are paying a carbon tax, and that is, lower in Europe, and it makes the difference on the returns to being in Europe elsewhere, then it's definitely gonna help. I suppose the question would be, does it give Europe enough sort of time to make that impact sort of noticeable, or does everybody else follow suit and you just end up in another sort of kind of in a way a sort of tit for tat carbon border adjustment mechanism sort of system. But I think that and duties actually do matter, and I think are going to help to incentivize parts of the value chain to come to Europe already. I think part of the issue is that to attract particularly companies from Asia, it's sort of harder for them to justify the production in Europe because of some of these current I guess you'd say sort of fiscal or other sort of measures that simply make the projects less attractive compared to their home jurisdiction. So I think that's been certainly something I've noticed that several of and I think maybe also be part of the sort of US sort of differentiator as well is that arguably you could probably say Europe is the hardest place to do business on several levels, and I think it's been difficult for some Asian companies to contemplate setting up in Europe because of that. Even compared to the US, I think we're quite often it's sort of there's things to overcome that are quite challenging based on where you sort of have your existing infrastructure. So I think Carbon Border is another of those that should promote domestic supply chain, but the reality is it'll probably mean that certain things certainly won't be any cheaper because of it.
Okay, we've only got I think 1 minute left. So final question, Robert: how do mining companies access this lovely government money?
Well, it's not government money because there's none of that sloshing around for this. At least directly, I think that's going to be the key difference. I think it's a sort of a difficult sort of question to answer. I mean, the challenge in Europe is that you have these restrictions on industry incentives, but there again, there are mechanisms on a sort of state level that may be more available to sort of companies to tap. There's no easy pool of money like there is in the US at the moment. I don't think that's going to be the case in Europe, unfortunately. But indirectly, you may start seeing some sort of availability of capital from other sources that are either, say, for example, government backed or de-risked, that may help to flow into delivering what Europe needs in terms of raw materials.
Excellent. Unfortunately, we've run out of time there, but thank you very much, Robert and Morten.
Thanks, Lien.